In addition to linear and radial gradients, we can define gradients that are infinitely repeated in any direction. Let's find out how. Repeating gradients are essentially extensions of the linear and radial gradients. Think of them as repeating background images that repeat both vertically and horizontally. And we won't have to learn any new syntax here. The great thing is that the syntax for repeating gradients is exactly the same syntax we used in the previous videos for the non-repeating linear and radial gradients. Both take the same type of arguments and are interpreted the same way. To create a basic repeating linear gradient, we'll need at least 2 color values and 1 color stop position. So let's start by typing WebKit, since I'm using Chrome, followed by repeating linear gradient and a set of parentheses. So our first color value will be an RGBA value of light blue. And I'll make that an 80% opacity. So I'll go ahead and follow this with an RGB value of a darker shade of blue. And I will give it a color stop position of 50 pixels. So let's save this out and see what it looks like in the browser. When we refresh the page, we see that this infinitely repeats the color and stop positions from top to bottom. The color stops are shifted by multiples of the difference between the last color stop position and the first color stop's position. So here, they're spaced out by 50 pixels as defined by the last color stop. We didn't set one for the first RGBA value, so therefore its position is 0. But if we add a value of 20 pixels, we can see how they are now shifted and spaced out by 30 pixels, which is the difference between 50 pixels and 20 pixels. With repeating gradients, if the gradient does not start and end with the same color, the result is a sharp transition. As we can see here, there is a hard edge between the two colors. But if we add another color stop to the end with the same RGBA value, and I'll go ahead and add a color stop position of 70 pixels. I'll save this. Now, when we refresh, we can see how the color transitions are now much smoother, and they're shifted apart by 50 pixels, or the difference between 70 pixels and 20 pixels. Like with non-repeating linear gradients, we can add a directional keyword to change the direction of the repeating gradient. So let's add the keyword left to the beginning here. We'll refresh the browser, and now we see the repeating gradient displayed horizontally. So next, we'll go ahead and create another repeating gradient. This time, we will add an angle of negative 45 degrees. And for our RGBA color, we'll change the opacity to 90%, and we'll change the color stop position to 2%. And we'll change the next color stop position to 10%, and we'll go ahead and remove this last color stop here. So we'll save this, and we'll review it in the browser, and we can see how this creates a simple diagonal pattern by the repetition of the lines. So we can create all sorts of interesting effects with repeating gradients. For example, back in our CSS, I will go ahead and add another color stop using the same first RGBA value defined, and I will add a stop position of 11%. And I'll change this one from 10% to 9%. So we'll save this. Now when we refresh, we can see how this creates this sort of textured repeating pattern. Next up, a repeating radial gradient also works similar to a radial gradient. So in our CSS, we can type repeating radial gradient. And let's go ahead and change our arguments here inside the parentheses. For our first argument, we'll start with an RGBA value. And we will give it an 80% opacity. And we will follow that with an RGB value. We will give this value a 20 pixel color stop position, and we'll follow it with another RGBA value and a color stop position of 60 pixels. So let's take a look at this in the browser. When we refresh, we see how this creates this sort of neat ripple effect. Now let's create another circular gradient, one that's much larger than this. In our style sheet, we'll first need to set the origin to be in the top left corner of our div. So we can do that with the values 0, 0. And we will make it a circular gradient. So we can use the circle keyword for that. And we will go ahead and use the same RGB and RGBA values. I'll just remove this last value here. And I'll change the color stop position to 100 pixels. And let's add an alpha value to this of 0.85. So I'll save this out. We'll take a look at it in the browser. So there's our new gradient. It's much larger now and offset to the top left corner. These repeating gradients are all resizable. So even if we resize the box, I'll go ahead and bump this up to 900 pixels. We can see how resizing the box affects our repeating gradients. Because gradients can be applied with the background property, we can take advantage of the multiple background syntax to apply multiple gradients using comma-separated values. And by doing that, we can create all sorts of patterns and interesting backgrounds. Throughout this deep dive, we've been creating our gradients manually using various colors, shapes, color stop positions, and other parameters, which is great, but there are also great tools available to help us generate gradients. Currently, the most powerful tool out there is ColorZilla's Ultimate CSS Generator. This is a free and easy to use editor that allows us to create all sorts of complex multi-stop gradients using the linear and radial gradient syntax. We can use all the color formats available, like hex values, RGBA, and HSLA. We can even import a gradient from an image, and it will convert the image to a CSS gradient. It has a ton of other features and presets we can use, but most importantly, it gives us cross-browser CSS output, even for older versions of IE. You can check out the editor at colorzilla.com/gradient-editor. Finally, when creating gradients, remember to always include a fallback color or image for those older browsers that do not support CSS gradients. The good news is that the latest browsers that do support them will not load the fallback image, so performance will not be affected.